All right, let's dive into one of the most incredible animals on the entire planet, the Alaska moose. You've probably heard it called the king of the forest, right? It's a title that just fits. But have you ever wondered how it got that name and what really makes this giant so unbelievably special?
I mean, who can't relate to this? This creature is so legendary, but at the same time, it can be so hard to find. Spotting one in the wild? That's a huge deal. It's pretty much the #1 animal that tour guides get asked about. So let's get into what makes this animal so totally captivating.
Okay, first things first, we've got to clear something up, because this confuses everyone. When early Europeans got to North America, they saw this big deer and they called it an elk. The problem? Back in Europe, the animal we call a moose is called an elk. So to make it super simple, what we're talking about is a moose in North America. In Europe, it's an elk, and that animal North Americans call an elk? Yeah, that's a totally different thing.
So that title, King of the Forest, it's not just some cool modern nickname. It's actually packed with history. And what's really funny is, the moose wasn't always the king. For the longest time, believe it or not, that title actually belonged to the bear. But the moose's place in folklore goes incredibly deep.
Just think about that for a second. This animal was so fundamental to survival, so central to their culture, as a source for food, tools, everything, that it was literally immortalized in their ancient alphabet. It became a symbol of life itself, of protection. It was a core part of their world.
Okay, so let's shift gears from the myth and the folklore to the raw, physical reality of the Alaska moose. Because the legend, well, it's backed up by some truly mind-blowing numbers.
First off, let's talk height. A big male moose can stand over 2.1 meters tall. That's almost 7 feet, and that's just at the shoulder. Picture standing next to one. Its back would be towering way over your head. It's just immense. And then you've got the weight. We're talking over 635 kilograms, or 1,400 pounds. To give you some perspective, that's about the same as a small car. And get this, the biggest one ever recorded tipped the scales at a whopping 820 kilograms. And of course, you can't talk about a moose without talking about the antlers. They can span an average of 1.8 meters across. That's a 6-foot wingspan, and they are way more than just decoration. They're like a giant biological billboard advertising how healthy and strong that moose is to any rivals or potential mates. Now, the males, or the bulls, are about 40% heavier than the females, the cows. And this huge difference is a classic example of something called sexual dimorphism. It's all driven by that intense competition between the males to win mating rights. Bigger is definitely better in their world.
So, we know they're enormous, but what are they actually like? How does a giant like this spend its days? Let's take a peek into the daily life and habits of this solitary giant.
For such a massive animal, the moose lives a really quiet, solitary life. They don't really form social bonds. They usually only get together to mate, and that's when the bulls become super aggressive. A mother is also fiercely protective of her calf, raising it all on her own. But there's this one really clever exception to their solo lifestyle. In the deep winter snow, they'll actually follow in each other's footsteps to create paths, just to save precious energy. Smart, right? You'd think an animal this big would just plow through the forest eating anything it could find, but nope. Moose are actually pretty picky eaters. They don't just graze on grass, they're browsers. They use their tough lips to strip the leaves off branches, and they actively look for the tastiest, least bitter plants like aspen and willow. They're selective giants. And here's one of my favorite little details, because it just doesn't make any sense. For all its size and power and sheer presence, the moose does not have some big booming roar. Its voice has been described as nasal and peeping. It's just a hilarious contrast for an animal that can weigh more than a car.
So far, we've been looking at the moose as an individual animal, right? Its size, its habits, but its true importance goes so much deeper than that. You see, the moose doesn't just live in the forest, it actively builds the forest.
So let's kind of challenge our own perspective here for a minute. Is this creature just another big animal hang out in the woods? Or is it something more? Well, as it turns out, its role is way more fundamental than you might think. Modern science is totally changing how we see the moose. We're learning it's not just some passive resident of the forest. No way. It's a critical, active force that shapes the health and the very structure of its entire home. And that brings us to this really important idea in ecology. The moose is what's known as an indicator species.
Put simply, that means the health of the moose population is a direct reflection of the health of the entire forest. If the moose are doing well, the forest is probably doing well. If they're struggling, it's like a check engine light for the whole ecosystem.
This all adds up to its role as an ecosystem engineer. Think about it. By munching on trees like willow and birch, they control which plants grow and where. Their waste fertilizes the soil, recycling key nutrients. The paths they plow through the snow in winter become literal highways for smaller animals. In other words, just by living its life, the moose is managing and maintaining the biodiversity of its entire kingdom.
So, we've seen the moose as this cultural icon, a physical powerhouse, and a master architect of its own environment. It's a lot to take in. So where does all of this leave the king of the forest today?
We started with the animal, this solitary giant of just incredible size. Then we saw it as an icon, a creature straight out of folklore and legend. And finally, we understood it as an engineer, a vital force that literally shapes the world around it.
And this really isn't just a question about one animal. It's about the health of the planet's great northern forests. The moose's future is tied directly to the fate of its kingdom. And as that kingdom faces more and more challenges, the future of its quiet, powerful, and absolutely essential king really does hang in the balance.